wet, heavy sound of something dragging its bloated, waterlogged weight up the aluminum ladder of our rented luxury houseboat in the dead center of Lake Oakhaven at 3:14 a.m. was the exact moment our anniversary trip turned into a living nightmare. But the true psychological terror didn't fully set in until the VHF marine radio, which I had physically unplugged from the wall battery 2 hours prior because of the relentless static, suddenly crackled back to life with a deafening screech of interference that slowly morphed into the rhythmic, wet, choking sob of Sierra's younger sister, Clara, who had tragically drowned in this very reservoir exactly 10 years ago. I stood frozen in the middle of the dark, cramped cabin, my hand still holding the useless power cord of the radio, listening to that impossible, watery voice whispering my name. Logan, why did you let them build the dam? It's so cold down here in the dark. While Sierra slept soundly just a few feet away on the small berth, completely oblivious to the freezing draft that had suddenly swept through the boat, bringing with it the nauseating, heavy stench of rotting lake algae, dead fish, and ancient, stagnant river mud. Lake Oakhaven was famous for being an engineering marvel of the late 1950s, a massive, artificial reservoir created by flooding an entire historic Appalachian valley called Blackwood, burying a small, thriving town of 300 people beneath 200 feet of murky, freezing water. But this summer's historic drought had sunk the lake to record low levels, exposing the skeletal, rotting wooden steeples of the old churches and the jagged, rusted tin roofs of submerged houses that now jutted out of the glassy, black water like decaying fingers reaching up from a watery grave. We had rented the driftwood houseboat for a quiet, isolated week away from the city, wanting nothing more than a float in the deep, peaceful wilderness of the recreation area. But as the days went on, the silence of the lake began to feel less like peace and more like a suffocating, heavy pressure pressing against our eardrums, as if the water itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the surface. I looked over at the digital GPS mapping unit mounted on the dashboard, and my stomach plummeted when I realized the blue triangular icon representing our boat was slowly drifting directly over the coordinates marked Blackwood Valley Historical Cemetery, even though I had dropped our heavy iron anchor into the 60 feet of water near the rocky cliffs hours ago, meaning the boat was somehow being pulled backward against the current, dragging the heavy steel chain along the rocky, drowned valley floor. A sudden, violent shudder rippled through the entire frame of the houseboat, making the wooden cabinets rattle and causing Sierra to stir, her eyes fluttering open in the dim, red emergency light of the cabin as she muttered in a groggy, confused voice, asking if we had hit a stray log or if the wind was picking up, but I couldn't find the words to tell her that the lake was dead calm, as flat as a sheet of black glass under a moonless, starless sky, and that the shudder we felt wasn't a collision, but rather the heavy iron anchor chain groaning under immense vertical tension, vibrating so intensely that it hummed like a low-frequency bass note through the floorboards. I tried to calm my racing heart, stepping carefully toward the sliding glass door at the stern of the boat, peering out into the thick, swirling fog that had rolled off the hills and completely swallowed the shoreline, reducing our entire world to a 10-foot radius of damp, heavy mist that clung to my skin like cold cobwebs. The dragging sound on the ladder had stopped, replaced by a soft, wet tapping on the outer fiberglass hull of the boat, a sound that started near the waterline and slowly, methodically moved upward like cold, soft fingers searching for a seam in the cabin walls. Sierra sat up, rubbing her eyes, her gaze drifting toward the glass-bottomed viewing well in the center of the cabin floor, a luxury feature of the driftwood designed to let tourists watch the fish swim beneath the boat. But as she stared into the illuminated square of water, her face drained of all color, her lips parting in a silent gasp as she pointed a trembling hand toward the glass, whispering, "Logan, what is that? Oh my God, what is that down there?" I walked over and looked down, the small LED lights lining the viewing well casting a pale, greenish glow through the thick double-pane glass, and my breath caught in my throat as I saw not fish, but a thick, swirling cloud of dark, gray silt rising from the bottom of the lake, and floating directly within that silt, just inches below the glass, was a human hand, pale, shriveled, and completely white. Its fingers gently tapping against the glass pane, followed by the slow, horrifying emergence of a face. It wasn't a decayed corpse, which would have been terrifying enough, but rather a shifting, semi-translucent figure of a young woman dressed in faded 1950s floral clothing, her eyes completely hollow and dark, filled with swirling lake water, her mouth opening in a silent scream that resonated directly through the glass, matching the exact frequency of the static now screaming from our unplugged marine radio. I grabbed Sierra's arm, pulling her back from the viewing well as a loud, metallic bang echoed from the bow of the boat. The sound of the anchor chain snapping under a sudden, colossal downward force, causing the nose of the houseboat to dip violently into the water, throwing us both to the floor as a wave of icy lake water splashed over the front deck. The emergency generator in the back sputtered and died with a high-pitched whine, plunging us into pitch-black darkness, save for the pale, eerie green light still glowing from the viewing well, which was now surrounded by several more pale, waterlogged hands pressing against the glass, their fingernails scratching a horrific, screeching rhythm against the reinforced acrylic. "We have to get to the auxiliary dinghy. Logan, please, we have to leave right now," Sierra screamed, her voice cracking with pure, primal panic as she clutched my shirt, her body shaking violently as the temperature in the cabin dropped so low that our breath began to fog in the air, smelling more and more of wet rot and ancient, undisturbed dust. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen counter and clicking it on, the bright beam cutting through the damp darkness of the cabin, revealing that the moisture on the inside of our windows wasn't condensation, but wet, muddy handprints that had formed on the glass, as if someone had been sliding their hands along the exterior of the boat, trying to peer inside at us. I pushed open the heavy wooden door leading to the bow deck, the cold night air hitting my face like a physical blow, carrying with it the distant, haunting sound of church bells ringing. A physical impossibility, because the only church for 20 miles was the drowned Methodist Church of Blackwood Valley, sitting locked and empty under 100 feet of water directly beneath our hull. The beam of my flashlight danced across the water, and what I saw made my knees buckle. The lake was no longer empty, but filled with hundreds of dark, silent shapes floating just beneath the surface, their pale faces illuminated by the flashlight beam, all of them staring up at our boat with wide, hollow, unblinking eyes, their bodies swaying gently with the movement of the currents like a forest of drowned souls. On the front deck, standing directly in front of our steering console, was a tall, dripping wet figure of a man wearing a thick, woolen miner's coat from a bygone era, his back turned to us, his body stiff and motionless as water poured from his sleeves and hem, pooling on the wooden deck boards in dark, thick streams that smelled of rusted iron and decay. "Hey, who are you? Get off our boat," I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound authoritative, but the figure didn't turn around. Instead, his head tilted at an unnatural, broken angle, a wet, rattling sigh escaping his chest as he spoke in a deep, hollow voice that sounded like grinding stones underwater, saying, "The valley remembers what you drowned to keep your lights on. The old homes are dry now, and we are so hungry." Slowly, the figure began to turn around, and the flashlight beam revealed that his face was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, gaping cavity filled with writhing, black lake leeches and wet river silt, his arms reaching out toward us with long, muddy fingers that ended in sharp, splintered bone where his fingernails should have been. Sierra let out a piercing shriek, scrambling backward into the cabin, but as she did, a massive crack echoed through the boat as the glass-bottomed viewing well on the floor finally shattered under the relentless pressure of the entities below, a torrent of freezing, black water geysering into the cabin, bringing with it the pale, waterlogged arms of the drowned townspeople who began crawling through the opening like spiders, their wet, gray bodies slick with mud as they dragged themselves onto the carpet. I rushed back inside to save Sierra, but the cabin was already flooding rapidly the freezing water swirling around our knees as the houseboat began to list heavily to one side, its fiberglass hull groaning and cracking under the weight of the water and the supernatural force pulling us down into the depths. I grabbed Sierra's hand, trying to pull her toward the stairs leading to the upper observation deck, but the cold, bloated hand of a drowned child shot out of the rising water, locking onto my ankle with a grip like an iron vise. Its skin freezing cold, sending a jolt of numbing pain up my leg that made me fall face first into the freezing floodwater. I coughed and gasped, the taste of stagnant, copper-flavored lake water filling my mouth as I struggled against the relentless pull, looking up through the dark water to see Sierra screaming my name, her fingers slipping from mine as three more waterlogged figures, their faces twisted into silent, hollow grins, rose from the shattered floor well and wrapped their wet, gray arms around her waist, dragging her backward into the dark, churning vortex of the flooded cabin. "Logan, help me. Don't let them take me down," she screamed, her voice cut short as she was pulled completely beneath the surface, her flashlight falling into the water and casting a spinning, distorted beam of light that illuminated her pale, wide eyes staring up at me through the black water before she disappeared entirely into the flooded depths of the boat. With a desperate, adrenaline-fueled surge of strength, I kicked wildly at the creature holding my ankle, my boot finally smashing its decayed wrist and breaking its grip, allowing me to scramble up the metal ladder to the upper sun deck. Gasping for air as the houseboat groaned one last time, its nose pitching straight up into the air as the heavy stern sank rapidly into the black abyss of Lake Oakhaven. I clung to the railing of the upper deck as the boat was pulled down, the freezing water rising up my chest, my neck, and finally my chin, until I was forced to let go and swim upward into the cold, blinding fog, my muscles cramping violently in the freezing temperature as I desperately tried to keep my head above water. The silence that followed was absolute. The houseboat had disappeared completely beneath the surface, leaving nothing but a few floating seat cushions and a swirling patch of oil on the glassy water. The dense, heavy fog settling over me like a suffocating blanket, cutting off all sense of direction until I was completely lost in the middle of the massive, dark reservoir. I floated there for what felt like hours, my body numb, my breath shallow, listening to the eerie, rhythmic chiming of the drowned church bells vibrating through the water against my chest, a sound that grew louder and closer with every passing second, accompanied by a soft, synchronized whispering that seemed to come from the water itself, thousands of invisible voices murmuring in perfect unison. "Join us. The valley is beautiful in the dark. Join us, Logan." I closed my eyes, too exhausted to swim, too cold to fight, when suddenly I felt a cold, wet hand gently wrap around my ankle from the darkness below, followed by another hand gripping my waist, and then another, their touch surprisingly gentle now, almost welcoming, as they began to slowly, inevitably drag me downward into the silent, frozen streets of Blackwood, where the rotting, waterlogged houses stood waiting in the dark, their doors wide open to welcome the new residents of the drowned town. And as the last bubbles of air escaped my lungs, I saw Sierra's pale face floating in the darkness before me, her hollow, waterlogged eyes staring into mine, her lips parting to whisper one final, chilling welcome. "Welcome home, Logan. We've been waiting for you."